And we're talking about a prince today who became a king, so it seems absolutely appropriate place to talk about this. And it's a huge pleasure for me to be here, and especially to introduce Charles Spencer and to talk to him about his work. Charles is here as a really vivid and terrific historian, but he's actually a man of many parts, I think. For the past few years, he's been restoring his ancestral home, which is in the heart of England, where the family have lived for 500 years, is that right? And before that, he was a reporter with NBC, National Broadcasting, in the States and in Europe. So I think that it's very interesting when someone has been a reporter and has to talk directly to people, that sort of vividness and immediacy is there in his books, and it really brings them to life. But then, I had different engagements with the literary world, because at Althorp, his home, he also has his own literary festival, yeah?
Well, it's rather smaller than this. I think we have 3,000 people over a weekend, so this is rather daunting.
Yes, but it's lovely because you know both sides of festival life, and is of course a writer, and over the past few years has written several historical works, starting with the extraordinary story of your own family, yeah?
Yes, that was a bit of a coffee table book, and then I did one on the house,
Yes.
and then on the family, and then the last four have been rather less self-absorbed, I hope.
Yes, well, I don't think they're self-absorbed when you're looking back in time. But there's a very good best-selling book on a British victory at the Battle of Blenheim, at 1704, I think, so the start of the 18th century. But the last two have gone back to the English civil wars, which was such a tumultuous time in Britain. And with the Commonwealth, the death of the king and the Commonwealth, our only time or chance of a republic. And after that comes the restoration of the crown. So the book before this one, which was called Killers of the King, was about the regicides, the men who signed the death warrant of Charles I, who was executed publicly, beheaded, outside his palace in Whitehall. An extraordinary moment in British history. And this book, when you wrote about the regicides, it was amazingly sort of even-handed. I think that's what surprised people reading it. And a lot of them reappear in the current book as soldiers, because this book, To Catch a King, which is a fabulous story, is about the young Charles, his son, who was in exile in France and then in the Netherlands, but who made a kind of wild attempt, really, 1650, 1651, to invade England with the help of the Scots to reclaim his crown. And there is a great battle at Worcester in 1651, after which Charles had to escape. And this is the story of his escape. And you will see that it's not the kind of behavior or life that you expect a royal prince to lead for the time that he is on the run. But what fascinates me, out in this book also, the character of Charles is very subtle and changing. And you see he's very young, and you see him growing up in these few weeks, really, when he's in his flight. But I wonder what do you think his life was like before that? What was it like growing up with his brothers and sisters in Whitehall, in the palace?
Well, the Charles II that I present in this book, which is, as Jenny says, is really an escape story, drawing on original sources and trying to keep the narrative driving forward, which is not difficult when his life was on the line. What surprises me as a general theme of the book is that a king who most British people think of as the ultimate in decadence and looseness, actually, when it really mattered, had what it took to survive against extraordinary odds. And I think his childhood did play some part in this, because the English Civil War broke out in 1642, and Charles, as a 12-year-old boy, took part in the first battle at Edge Hill. And he was there at the beginning, and then, as Jenny mentioned, the Battle of Worcester at the end, 9 years later. He was actually a fighting man at some points, and this is a great surprise to English people who think of him surrounded by mistresses and worrying about his racehorses, that this was a man of action. And in fact, his father and mother were the sort of, the tensions between them were the sort of backdrop, I think, to his life. They loved each other. They had a tricky first 3 years because the king seemed rather more interested in the Duke of Buckingham than his wife. But after the Duke of Buckingham died, things got a little more conventional. And at that point, they embarked on what was actually a very happy marriage. But there was one bone of contention in this marriage, and it was religion. Now, Charles's mother was a French princess, a Catholic, who, frankly, the last thing she wanted to do was marry the most powerful Protestant in Europe. But she was persuaded to do it. But she wrote secret letters to the Pope saying that she would take on this undertaking on the condition that she would try and turn England back to Roman Catholicism. And she tried to do this through her own children to start with. So the English Civil War really unraveled for the king from quite an early stage. From about 2 years in, it was sliding very much towards Parliament's. It was going to end up with a parliamentary victory, I think, from 1644. And the king, in ever-increasing moments of desperation, would write to his children, who had scattered to various parts of Europe at different times. And he said, "You must obey your mother in all things except religion." And so this was something that the king was a very extreme version of Anglican Protestantism, and his wife was this Catholic. And this caused huge tension for Charles, and is really the backdrop for this story, because Charles II was, as a young man, he was given command of an army in the southwest of England when his father's cause was already technically defeated. And then he was pushed ever further westwards until there really wasn't anywhere to go in England. And there were two forces at work at this point, very conventional group of his father's advisors, who said, "Look, you have to stay in British dominions because that's the only way we can really keep people loyal to you." And at the same time, his mother had escaped to France, pursued by boats firing cannon at her. That she was a very unpopular figure from the parliamentary point of view because she was Catholic and French. Never a good combination at this time for the English. And when she got her safely to France, she thought, well, here I am, I'm a French princess, I can bring France in on the side of the royalist English, and we can reclaim power. But the French, rather like today actually, rather liked seeing the English tearing themselves in two over a political question. Yes. And they didn't want to help at all. In fact, they took a decidedly standoffish view about the whole thing. And at this point, Henrietta Maria, Charles's French princess mother, decided that the only thing she could do with her son, Charles II, was market him as an eligible royal bachelor. And she decided to look for a suitable bride. And she alighted on the Grande Mademoiselle, the richest French princess that was around. She was a little bit older than Charles. And I feel very sorry for her in my story, actually, because I think she was 19 at the time, and we have her diaries in which she agonizes over what's her most beautiful feature, because there's so many, it's a very difficult competition. And so she writes at length about the ruby redness of her lips and the petiteness of her feet. But however attractive she was, it didn't work with Charles. He was not remotely interested. And she complained at length that he was a typical English upper-class buffoon who could only talk about horses and dogs, which is a common affliction, I hear. But at this stage, the whole marriage plan was falling apart, and Charles was deeply humiliated because he was being pushed forward to marry this woman. He didn't find her remotely attractive. His mother was appalled that he wasn't taking one for the team, really. And at this point, he decided that he really ought to try something else. And his mother was saying, you must get an ally who can support us, because sadly France isn't coming to our side. And the first option seemed to be the Irish. They were Roman Catholic. This was very controversial at the time, but by this stage, Charles had been persuaded to take on any allies. But Oliver Cromwell went over to Ireland and basically destroyed the opposition very quickly. And Charles threw in his lot with the Calvinist Scots. And they were a pretty dour bunch, frankly. The Kirk party were the dominant sort of force, and they were a cross between a political and a religious force. And they found it very difficult to side with a young man who was already showing fairly clear signs of decadence. He'd already had his first of his dozen illegitimate children. And at this stage, Charles had to completely compromise because he needed a Scottish army. But it was a real long shot, as Jenny mentioned in the introduction, because the Scots didn't really want to get involved in this whole war with England. And they were very happy to defend Scotland, but they didn't really want to invade England. And Charles and the Scots, who were on his side, really found each other very testing company. And Charles, I think, from his humiliation in France, the way he had been treated there as this sort of piece of eligible meat. And then when he was over in Scotland, they told him repeatedly that his family was sinful, which is why they had effectively lost 2 civil wars. It was a very uneasy truce. And he took the huge gamble, this young man of 21 by this stage, of invading England with a half-hearted and very under-equipped Scottish army. So under-equipped, in fact, that their artillery regiment only had cannon made of leather, not metal. So they trundled south ever more despondently and arrived at Worcester.
Yes, and I think that we forget, because when the Restoration eventually comes, Charles is 30, exactly how young he was. So that exile and that marketing, as you say, I mean, must have been very, very hard. And his father, I think, had given, before he died, had sent letters, had given instructions that the one thing he must do was to keep himself safe. And as you say, it's a huge risk invading with an army like that. And also his time in Scotland was clearly very, very rough. But did he have good commanders to help him or not?
Well, one of the tragedies of Charles's compromise, by reaching a compromise with the Kirk party in Scotland, one of the things he had to do was throw to the wolves the greatest royalist commander that they had in Scotland, a man called the Marquis of Montrose, an incredibly charismatic figure who, with very, very small royalist forces, had won some spectacular victories during the civil wars. But he had won victories against the people who were now Charles II's new allies. And while Jenny and I today are going to be talking, and are talking, about Charles's finest 6 weeks of his life, we have to remember that he did something really shoddy. And he wrote to the Marquis of Montrose, who had really sacrificed everything for Charles and his father, and said, "I'm afraid I'm now an ally with your worst enemies. And you're a Knight of the Garter, which is the biggest honor he could give him, but you're also on your own." And very soon after that, Montrose was defeated in battle, and he went on the run in the Highlands of Scotland, and he was reduced to such appalling circumstances that he ended up eating his own leather gloves to stay alive. And then he went to a man who he thought was a friend to help save him, and the friend duly sold him to his enemies, and Montrose was taken to Edinburgh. He was denied the common nobleman's death of the axe and was hanged. He died very bravely. But, you know, there's a sort of moment of karma when Charles was marching through Scotland to meet his new allies. As he went past Aberdeen, one of the great cities of Scotland, he saw something pinned above the gateway there, and he asked what it was. And it was a quarter of the Marquis of Montrose. He had been chopped up and dispatched to various cities to discourage people from going against the Kirk. So the irony of this invasion into England was that Charles already lost his only great Scottish general through treachery. And although he had some quite seasoned veterans from the 30 Years' War over in Europe among his commanders, they really had no hope of victory. They were very realistic about it. Their letters home were full of despair. It didn't help the fact that when they appeared before English cities, people would sort of laugh at them and close the gates and tell them to move on. And it was only when they got to Worcester. Worcester's a city in the west of England that had always been a royalist stronghold. It was only then that they received a warm welcome. Now, Charles hadn't wanted to go to Worcester. He had hoped that he would head to Oxford and then march on London. And he had hoped that lots of royalists would come to him, but they didn't. The parliamentary commanders at this time were incredibly professional, and they had all the leading royalists either in prison or subjected to a curfew. They weren't allowed to leave more than 5 miles from their homes, and if they did, they'd be arrested. So Charles advanced southwards with a totally demoralized army, and he was shadowed by 3 armies that each of them was equal to his. So when he arrived in Worcester, Oliver Cromwell turned up, and he was so sure of victory that he stood down one of the armies just to scoop up the survivors after the inevitable victory.
Yes.
So they knew they were going to, once they were beaten, they were Scottish, they were going to head back north to Scotland. So the most extraordinary part of this story, in my point of view, is that Charles II, or anyone else who escaped with him, every road going north from Worcester was already blocked by parliamentary patrols waiting to scoop them up. So the whole thing was desperate. Actually, on the day of the battle, in 1651, Charles was incredibly brave. We have eyewitness accounts of him in the real heat of battle in all places. But he started that morning on Worcester Cathedral, looking out over these fields glistening with enemy. And he started the day as King of Scotland, hoping to become King of England. But by the end of the day, he was simply the most wanted outlaw in the country, with a huge price on his head.
Yes, and they always, in the parliamentary broadsheets and things, refer to him as the King of Scotland, don't they? And this is seen as a Scottish invasion, nothing to do with legitimacy or the king, and they don't call him by any royal title at all. But because there's an animosity already existing between the British and the Scots. So
The English and the Scots.
English and the Scots.
No, you're absolutely right. I would say what's extraordinary was the disgust that each had for each other. They both saw each other as sort of verminous, really. You have all these accounts of where enormous numbers of Scots were killed in battle that day, probably about 4,000. Yeah. And the remaining maybe 10,000 fled, and a huge majority of them were captured. But when they were held in churches or whatever as prisoners, the accounts afterwards of having to clean the place out because the Scots had been there. I mean, it really is an astonishing antagonism for neighbours to have.
Yes, and they also thought that Charles would go north with the Scottish army, didn't they, to begin with?
Well, the most extraordinary thing was how good Charles was at escaping. All his instincts were correct. He was well aware that having arrived with a large Scottish army, it hadn't done him any good at all. And when they were fleeing, he was fleeing initially with 3,000 men heading north to Scotland. And he took a very early decision that the most important thing was to get rid of these people. First of all, they were useless when they were sort of armed and had a hope of victory. But now they were completely a burden to him. And he decided to peel off from them. And the first things he does is disappear down endless sideways with just 60 men by the end. And he decided then, he got to a house, it's called White Ladies. It was a former convent which had been destroyed by a previous king, Henry VIII. And he was hidden there because one of his men, the Earl of Derby, had been defeated previously, and he knew that the people who inhabited that area had 2 things in his favor. They were Roman Catholic, and as Charles said when he heard that, they're good at hiding people because the Catholics have been persecuted since Elizabeth I's time. And then they were also, he knew they were royalists. And so the Earl of Derby handed him over to these 5 rather fantastic brothers called the Pendrell Brothers, who were very, very solid, basic Englishmen who viewed the king as a sort of semi-divine being. They believed in the divine right of kings, that during coronation, an element of godly blessing entered the soul of a king, and it was their duty, not just as royalists, but as good Christian men, to keep him alive. And they were very, very basic countrymen. They made a living from chopping wood, or one was a miller, another one was a sort of housekeeper, and they promised to look after him, and particularly one called Richard Pendrell, known to his family as Trusty Richard, so a pretty solid citizen. He was given charge of Charles, and the first full night after Charles's defeat, Charles by this stage had chopped off his hair and was wearing a disguise as a woodcutter. It was very hard to get him a disguise because he was 6'2" when people weren't. Yes. And so they had to cobble together all the clothing. And he decided to make a run for it to Wales. Wales was, the Principality had always supported the royalist cause. But they went through the night, and actually that very first night, Richard Pendrell saved the king's life because they decided they realized that every road was blocked with parliamentarians. So they went across country, and it was tough work. You know, Jenny in her introduction said how difficult it was for a man of royal birth to really rough it and escape. But one of the things that Charles's feet had never met before was imperfect footwear. And he was wearing sort of rough clogs. And very soon, as he was running across fields and through mud and through briars, etc., his feet were cut to ribbons. And he fell on the ground that first night sobbing and said, "Look, I don't care. They can catch me here. I just can't go a step further." And Richard Pendrell, in a sort of very English, basic way, just said, "Well, actually, I've promised to keep you alive, so I think we'll keep going, won't we?" And so my story could have had a rather quick end that first night, but luckily, Pendrell kept in going. And then there's this sort of wonderful, it falls into different aspects, the escape. But the first one, I call it in the book, the sort of Roman Catholic underground. And there's a sort of series of quite humble people through to people of sort of middling rank of the time who conspire to keep their future king alive.
Yes, and the relationship of the Pendrells is extremely touching, I think, because they're in it together as a family. So one brother says to another brother, "You take him here," and this kind of thing. And also you have this sense of Charles, he's 20, 21, you know, being bewildered, just at this moment being bewildered. And the thought of his cut feet is somehow awful, that you can't run because you're actually in agony. It pours with rain. He doesn't quite understand to begin with that he's really got to behave like an. So there's a great moment actually when, right at the beginning, when they say you're hungry, and he says, "Yes, I would like mutton for my dinner," and mutton to actually eat meat was something very rare for a poor family, and they hadn't eaten meat for months, I think.
Well, actually, yes, they hadn't eaten meat since their first child's baptism some years before.
Oh, right.
And it was it makes Charles sound so hopelessly incompetent in terms of manners, but he just didn't realize, when he wanted to eat meat, he could eat it 3 times a day. But these people, anyway, they very dutifully sent 2 of them out into a field to kill a lamb and bring it back. But what I love there's a sort of series of things that Charles learns on his 6 weeks on the run. And later in the piece, there's this wonderful moment where he's disguised as a servant, and they arrive at a big house, he and this lady who's on the run with him. And when they arrive, the people there don't know who he is. They just see a spare servant. And they say, "Right, we're very busy today, so you go and help in the kitchen." Well, he's not really seen a kitchen before. And then the cook, who is quite bossy by all accounts, we have the eyewitness accounts, she said, "Right, you go and help." And there was a rather complicated spit for roasting meat. And Charles falters for a moment, and she goes, "Call yourself a servant, and you don't know how to use a spit." And he, learning from his earlier gaucheness, says, "Well, please don't tell anyone, but my master's very poor and he can't afford meat." So it's wonderful to have taken the embarrassment of his early blunder and turn it into a moment which probably saved his life.
Yes, you do see him learning, and there are all sorts of the physical things which come across, like, to begin with, they give him a woodman's axe to carry, and he's never carried anything as heavy as that. So they swap it for a billhook or something lighter. But then he does learn their ways. But what you just touched on, the Catholic underground, that's particularly fascinating too, because that's goes back to a slightly earlier period of British history, because the Catholics were used to hiding the priests from persecution. And so these houses have amazing special secret places, the priest holes, and Charles has to hide in those. And they're very strange, those holes.
Yes, the Catholics are rather heroic in this tale, and so I will absolutely catch up with your point there. But the first one, there are so many fabulous characters in the story, yes, who come forward and do everything to save the king. And the Pendrell Brothers are persuaded that actually they've got to take him to a safer house further away. It's called Moseley Old Hall. It's still there, and you can still see the priest hole where he hides. The main man in the house is not the home owner, who's a royalist captain who was wounded at the Battle of Naseby, but a priest, a Roman Catholic priest called Father Huddleston. And Huddleston very much believed that he had been blessed by God, being given this charge of looking after the king's life. And he later wrote this incredible account of opening the door. He knew the Pendrell Brothers, they were local characters, but opening the door and being surprised to see that instead of 5 Pendrell Brothers, there were 6. And then looking closer and realizing that the 6th one actually was his Lord and Master, his king. And we have almost a biblical picture of Huddleston cleaning the battered feet of the king, giving him his shirt, giving him food, and looking after him, and really looking after him in such a way, and actually giving him Catholic texts to read, the long hours of boredom of hiding in this house. And Charles absorbed some of the life of the saints and all sorts of books that were lying around, which Huddleston had. And I love Huddleston because he was so wrapped up in the joy, the euphoria of looking after this extraordinary figure that Charles II used to suffer very badly from nosebleeds. And when he had a nosebleed and Huddleston lent him his handkerchief, instead of getting it washed afterwards, Huddleston sent it to a Catholic friend in Europe to keep as a holy relic. So that gives you a view into the mindset of these people and the mission they felt they were on. And then, that while they were staying in one of these houses, the parliamentarians were combing the countryside. They were looking for any royalist. They were hoping to find the king. They weren't sure if he was among the several thousand who had died at the Battle of Worcester because they had been quickly stripped and robbed of anything on them. But there were all these wanted posters for him. Charles found that there was £1,000 on his head, an extraordinary figure. The leading Scottish general had £50 on his head. £1,000 was such an extraordinary amount of money that when Charles learnt that that was what was being offered, he assumed the Pendrells or whoever else was helping him would just hand him over and take the money. But they all said, no. There's a quote. One of them said, if it was £1 million, we wouldn't give you over. But with this priest hole, the one Jenny talks about, there was one that was particularly good in Moseley Old Hall, and it did save Charles's life, because when the parliamentarians came down, he hid in it. It's a tiny space, as I say, you can see it today. And it was incredibly well hidden. You had to move furniture and beams, etc., to get into it. But he managed to survive there. And then the sort of what happened at this point was he gets handed over from the Roman Catholic conspiracy to keep him alive to a sort of league of gentlemen officers who had all served his father and him in the Civil War. And one of them, the first one of these, is a man called Colonel Lane, who is a sort of traditional figure from the establishment as we'd see it. But he came with very, very good news, because I've mentioned already that the whole of England was sort of closed down. Royalists weren't allowed to move around. But Lane had this good news that his sister, Jane Lane, one of the great heroes of this piece, had been granted permission to go from the northwest of England down to Bristol, Bristol being the second city and the second port of England, and had permission to go and attend the birth that a cousin was going to be giving. And this she was allowed to do in the company of a manservant, and Charles quickly changed disguise.
Yes, it's a wonderful image of Charles and Jane Lane travelling together. But I suppose the most famous, this became a sort of myth, a story that school children learnt, not the whole escape, but one aspect of it, which we haven't mentioned, which is the most famous hiding place of all.
Yes, this is the reason why in England the second most popular name of pubs is the Royal Oak. There are 450 of them. And so Charles manages to, after his failed attempt to escape to Wales, he goes back to a house called Boscobel. And there he comes across a man with the marvellous name of Major Careless. And luckily he isn't. He's very careful. And he knows of a hiding place which he thinks will serve the king well. Because, as I mentioned, there are thousands of parliamentarians scouring the country for the king. And Major Careless says, well, I've hidden somewhere, and I think it's our best hope, because if we stay here, you'll definitely be caught. And it's up a particularly luxuriant oak tree. And Charles hides up it, and various members of the Pendrell family take position around the forest beneath and try and warn him when the parliamentarians are coming, which they do quite frequently. By this stage, Charles has had the adrenaline rush of a day fighting in battle, 2 sleepless nights, and a very tricky day in between, being pursued by everyone. And he's exhausted, and he goes to sleep on Major Careless's lap in the oak tree. And poor Careless is put in this sort of quandary of good manners as to what to do with a sleeping king who sent his legs to sleep, because he is a very big man, Charles. And, well, Careless realizes he's going to drop out with the king on his lap into a path where the parliamentarians are. So he has to put one hand over Charles's mouth and pinch him with the other. And Charles loved the whole drama of this. They managed to stay safe in that oak tree. And actually, it became the sort of motif of this whole escape. So when Charles comes back for the restoration, as Jenny mentioned, 9 years later, he really did celebrate that moment as the moment of his escape. And in fact, he turned the day of his birthday into Oak Apple Day. It became a public holiday in England for 200 years across the nation. He started a new order of to really compete with the Order of the Knights of the Garter. It's called the Order of the Oak Tree. That didn't survive. But everything oak-themed became very, very big. And actually, I'm afraid the tree itself became a victim of its own celebrity because people went up and cut bits off to make walking sticks or make snuff boxes. But the child of that tree still exists today at Boscobel. And you can see, not only was it, by all accounts, incredibly rich in leaf, but it also had it was a good vantage point to see what was going on. So it became the most famous tree in England, and it still, I suppose, remains it.
Yes, it is. I think the royal oak is what we think of, but I love a little detail of that story, which is the old woman who spends the whole day beneath the tree picking up sticks so that she can warn them, if parliamentarians are coming. And another interesting aspect, because we've come to Jane Lane, is how important women are in this escape. Yeah.
Yes, I love that. There are two very brave women who risk everything. I mean, what I should say, first of all, if the king had been caught, there is absolutely no doubt that he would have been executed. He'd already been found guilty of high treason. So in England at this time, if you were found guilty of high treason, there was no court case. You literally had to be identified, and then you'd be sent off for execution. And all they would have had to do is produce in court, if they needed to, if there was a dispute, 2 men who had seen the king in armour. That would have been enough, ready to fight his own countrymen. But at the same time, this extraordinary risk that the people who were helping him were taking, it was made clear in any fair, if you went to at this time in England, there would be proclamations read out by Parliament saying that if you helped the king, well, as they called him, Charles Stuart, or the King of Scotland, then you would be put to death in the most gruesome way, I'm afraid, hanged, drawn, and quartered, which was all deeply unpleasant, basically being mutilated before you died, and castrated too. And then they would keep you alive. They didn't know an awful lot about medicine, but they did know how to keep you alive long enough for you to see your guts being burnt in front of you. This was thought to be a bit of a privilege because of the notion, medieval notion really, which had hung over, that your worst thoughts resided in your stomach. So by burning your entrails in front of you, it was giving you a bit more hope in purgatory. It must have seemed small comfort at the time. But this was, so you had £1,000 reward on one side or agonizing death on the other. And what's astonishing is, I totted up, I think it's 52 people helped him during those 6 weeks. 52 people were in the know as to helping him. And none of them were tempted to give him up. In fact, you mentioned the lady under the tree. Her husband was caught by Parliament. Somehow they worked out he had had something to do with the escape. And he refused to say anything. I mean, they tortured him, and then they hanged him. But he, you know, they didn't. That was right at the beginning, so they hadn't got to the hanging, drawing, and quartering. But they were risking everything. And also, of course, if you, as the man of the house, were sent for execution, there was absolutely no safety net for your family. And there was one moment actually where there are so many points in the tale where you think, well, he has to get away now. Everything's lined up for the perfect escape. And there's a small port on the south coast of London of England called Charmouth, and a ship's captain had been bribed to meet a rowing boat with the king and his wonderful accomplice Wilmot, who I'm sure we'll get on to, in a rowing boat and scoop them off to France. And Charles and his companion Wilmot wait and wait and wait, and nothing happens. And it's only much later Charles finds out what had happened was that the captain, who had been bribed, hadn't cleared the escape with his wife. And she had been to a market that day and had heard the proclamation against anyone helping the king or any leading royalists. And when she noticed her husband packing up his sea chest, she said, well, you haven't told me about this. Where are you off to? And he hadn't really thought up a very convincing excuse. So she said, well, I bet you're helping those royalists, and I'm not going to have you being executed and the children and me left destitute. So she locked him up for the night. And Charles only discovered this years later, but he just didn't know what had happened. He thought it was all ready to go. So the backdrop is one of extraordinary risk that these people were taking on.
Yes, and extraordinary risk and extraordinary loyalty, because there's another husband and wife scene where the husband, in the end, in desperation, says to the king, can I tell my wife what's happening? And Charles says yes, because, and again, that's fine, that this is a great and noble thing to do. But when he's with the Lanes, they have to wait quite a long time, don't they, before Charles can ride with Jane Lane to Bristol. And then he rides as her servant on the horse with her.
Yes, it's extraordinary. The paintings, because Charles commissioned paintings to commemorate his great escape once he came back to England. And I love the little images you find out. So, for instance, in those days, if you were a lady of rank, as Jane Lane was, you got a very substantial horse and a double saddle, and your manservant basically drove the horse, and you sat on the back. So it's rather, I love those images. And they got on extremely well. I mean, who knows, they may have had some sort of relationship on the run. But Jane Lane is one of the great heroines of royal escapes. She's up there with Flora MacDonald, with Bonnie Prince Charlie. And she was really fun, very, very punchy lady, and very quick-witted. When they eventually arrived at her cousin's house, where she was allowed to go to attend the birth, they got there, and the trouble when they got to this house was it was waiting for the child to be born. And it took rather a long time. So they decided that the first thing they should do, if you think of these big English houses in the 17th century, they were bustling places of huge numbers of people coming and going. Not just the family that lived there, the servants who served the house and the household. There were endless guests coming with their own retinue, and of course people bringing food and sustenance and supplies to the house. So they thought, well, the safest thing we can do is pretend that Charles has flu. So he retires to the staff quarters at the top of the house and lolls around there for a few days. But then they think, well, we can't keep this going for long because it just looks too bizarre. And so he comes downstairs and he's walking through the main hall of the house when the lady of the house, coming the other way, has no idea who he is because they decide not to bring her in on the secret, even though she would have probably been on side. And Charles, being a well-mannered man, took off his hat and bowed to his hostess. And as he got up, he saw a man absolutely fixed looking at him, and he realized he had been spotted. And he was thinking, oh, the game's up. But actually what had happened was, by complete chance, that man had been part of his household when he had been a boy growing up outside London. And so he took him into his confidence. Occasionally, he had to take strangers, as it were, into his confidence in a sort of very quick decision of life and death. Is this man trustworthy? And at that point, as I mentioned earlier, this is all near Bristol, which is a bustling port. Charles sends this man to find out when the next ship is departing for France or Spain so he can get away. And the astonishing news comes back that there isn't one going for 2 months because all ships have been requisitioned by Parliament to prepare for an invasion of Jersey, one of the last bastions of royalism in the Channel Islands off France. And so he comes back, and Charles realizes he cannot stay in this house for one moment longer. And he takes Jane aside, and they come up, they concoct an excuse for her to be able to leave this household. By this stage, I'm afraid the poor lady had given birth and the child had died. So it was Jane's duty to stay with her, to comfort her. So they had to think of a very big excuse to get her away. So Charles delivers a note to her during dinner, very publicly, and it pretends that Jane Lane's father is dying, and his dying wish is to say goodbye to her before he departs. And so they leave, and they go on the run again. And it's an extraordinary, the tale is so bizarre. They end up, Charles ends up spending a day at Stonehenge as a sort of 17th century tourist, because that's a safe place to hide. And there are so many times where you think he's got to be caught, but he's very lucky because each time something saves him.
Yes, it is. It's an endless series of moments. Is it going to be now? And your book's really good because you feel that tension all the way through. But he does have good companions in a way, doesn't he? He has Careless, and then he has the wonderful Wilmot that you mentioned. And
yes,
he's
I love Wilmot. Lord Wilmot was deeply brave and even more deeply stupid. So he makes for a really fantastic character. So Charles realized when he was on the run that he had to rely on someone if he was going to head away, and he really had to rely on somebody. If things went wrong on his attempted escape, he wanted to meet Wilmot in a particular pub in London, and then they would chance it getting abroad from there. And Wilmot is a classic English gentleman of the old school. And he says, well, of course I'll go on the run with you, Your Majesty, but 2 things. One is, I'm a gentleman, so I'll ride. I refuse to walk. And the other one is, I refuse to wear a disguise because I don't want to look ridiculous. So there's this astonishing 6 weeks. First of all, we've got the king in perfect disguise doing his best. And then you've got Lord Wilmot, dressed as a cavalry general of the king's army, riding around England. The only time I see him deign to do any disguise is after he's visited a cousin, and he puts a hawk on his wrist, which must really have fooled the locals. And he careers around England. He seems to be quite confused by why he's being pursued most of the time, but he brought that on himself. Anyway, he is ultimately very brave, and he does occasionally draw people away from the scent of the king, and he does eventually get away with the king. So all in all, Wilmot works out fine. But sadly, he doesn't live to see the fruits of his escape because he dies before Charles is restored. But anyway, he's one of the great heroes. He's a sort of Don Quixote figure, really. He's quite mad, but quite admirable at the same time.
Yeah. And they do eventually get away to France. The Charmouth escape doesn't work, but they finally find a small boat near Brighton, don't they? And
yes,
and
there's
leave.
this sort of, it's so difficult to get away because, as I say, all these ships on the south and the west had been requisitioned. And then luckily, there's this man I'd never heard of before I researched the book, a royalist colonel called Colonel Gunter. And he went all along the south coast, Chichester, Brighton, etc., looking for a ship to take the king away. And wherever he goes, he said, nope, everyone says there's no ships available. And then he thinks, okay, so there's no English ships allowed to go anywhere, but there must be French ships going home. And he manages to find a French merchant who subcontracts a deeply shifty Englishman to take the king. And they eventually, as you say, they do get away with more terrifying ordeals on the way. They think they're being pursued by pirates, etc. They arrive in Fécamp in Normandy, Charles and Wilmot, in such a terrible state. I mean, I've been quite light during this session, but this was a really grueling 6 weeks with Charles being pursued and nearly being caught. And they were in such a terrible physical state, and also their clothes were in tatters, that when they arrive and check into a hotel in Normandy, the innkeeper takes one look at them and makes them pay up front because he thinks they're vagrants. Yes. And then the astonishing thing, the news gets around that the king's alive because nobody has assumed he's still alive at this point. Parliament's still checking everywhere. Directives are coming out from London to look in all sorts of places for the 6'2" man on the run. But they don't really think he's alive by this stage. He must be one of the mountain of dead at Worcester. And at the same time, the royalists have basically given up on him. Where is he after 6 weeks? He must be dead. So when he reappears, this is a period where the Christian God is seen as favouring the victors in battle. The people of Parliament had convinced themselves years before that God was on their side, because why otherwise were they having endless military successes? And the royalists were thinking, what on earth's going on? You know, our saviour, our future possible saviour, is alive. So they celebrated like crazy. And the parliamentarians hushed it up. And in fact, one of the great sources for my book was the diarist, who's very famous in England, the most famous diarist of all, called Samuel Pepys. Now, Peeps was a great figure of the 17th century, a member of Parliament. As a boy, he had witnessed the execution of Charles I, the hero of this tale's father, and had been quite enthusiastic about it. He thought it was a good thing. But by 1660, with the Restoration coming around, Samuel Pepys, like a lot of people, had suddenly become rather obviously royalist, because the tide had turned. And Pepys was on the ship that rescued Charles II and brought him back to England for his incredibly popular restoration. And Charles II sits on this ship and he says, well, let me tell you about the last time I was in England. And all these people who arrived from London were absolutely stunned. They had no idea about the drama of this story. And of course, it was the king's favourite tale. And he ends up telling them all these details. He's sitting there eating an enormous amount. He was a man of huge appetites in every direction, Charles II. And as he was scoffing, he told them about his 6 weeks on the run. And they were amazed. And in Pepys, it aroused in him the sort of instincts of an investigative journalist. And he spent the next 20-odd years tracking down the eyewitnesses, the people who had helped the king to escape, and even got 2 audiences in a row with the king himself in the early 1680s, when the king was relaxing in Newmarket. Well, the king relaxed most places, but this time he was relaxing in Newmarket. And while he was there, you can see the handwritten notes where Pepys has added bits from the second sitting with the king. It's astonishing how accurate the king was, because it checks out with all the other people who he had never conferred with, and it is so compelling. I feel that Pepys had intended to put it all together himself, but for whatever reason, he was very busy as a member of Parliament. Also, I suspect that when the king eventually died, he thought, well, it's not so interesting anymore. And also, Pepys actually suffered from very, very bad, almost blindness, bad eyesight later on. So, this is a tale that was waiting to be bound together, probably by someone hugely more talented than me. But what I tried to do is put it together as a driving narrative. Jenny mentioned before I used to work in TV. And so what I try and do, which is something I learnt back then, is write to picture. So, there's lots of historians who are much more intelligent than I am. But what I try and do is put the picture in your eye of what's happening. That's really what I try and do.
Well, I think that's absolutely what you feel when you read this book. You follow Charles. It's absolutely gripping. And for Charles himself as king, this remained, I think, the striking moment of his life, because it's rare for a king to be in touch with his people like that. And also it's a sort of bubble, isn't it? So he remembers it in that way. When you read the book, you will remember it too.
I'd love to just cut in, because that's such an interesting thing. See, what I love about Charles, it is a bubble, and he does... I think when he got the throne of England, he'd had a miserable time in exile for a very long time, sort of 14 years all in all. And I view him, when he gets the crown, people say, oh, he was very lazy and he was very decadent, and yes, he was. But it didn't serve his father very well, being incredibly busy. He lost his head. And then his younger brother loses his kingdom because he has lots of things to do. And in a way, being a very laissez-faire, take the attitude almost of a mega lottery winner. That's how I see Charles II. And why not enjoy life? You've been hiding in Cologne in Germany, unable to even pay your hotel bill during exile. And now you've got Britain to play with. It must have seemed quite fun. And then, what I love about Charles, if I can really fast forward you before we go to some questions, to the epitome of him, which is really right at the end in 1685. By this stage, he's in his mid-50s. He's really been a very energetic man all his life. But for 3 weeks in early 1685, he was in a vile temper because he had an ankle injury and he couldn't do all the things he loved. He loved playing tennis, he loved going swimming, he loved walking at huge pace around the parks of London. And all the courtiers were treading on eggshells because he was in such a vile mood. And then suddenly they all noticed with delight that he was back to his old self. And we have this picture of him. He goes to a party, absolutely typical Charles II party. There's singing, there's gambling. He's got 3 of his mistresses in attendance. It's a normal night for him. And then on the way back, he goes back to his palace with his 2 favorite courtiers in tow. And they accompany him up to his bedchamber. And one of them remembered later, rather ominously, the candle they were carrying up the staircase blew out. And then Charles goes to bed. And the 2 men stay in his quarters to look after him. And they notice that he's particularly noisy in the night, tossing and turning. And then they see him in the morning, and he looks deathly pale. And at 8 o'clock in the morning, he used to like to sit in his favorite chair, out looking at his favorite view to be shaved. And while this is happening, he suddenly has this massive convulsion. And then, poor man, he's handed over to ordeal by ignorant royal physician. And the 12 royal doctors appear. None of them has a clue as to what's gone wrong, but they take a punt that the thing they must do with this wretched figure is stimulate his system. And this involves a lot of laxatives, enemas. They cut off and shave off all his hair, and they burn his scalp with white-hot glass. They put some acid in the membrane of his nostrils. They give him a medicine made out of the ground skull of a human being, and they lay a poultice of pigeon droppings over his feet. Well, it doesn't go very well, and at some point they realize that he's on the way out. And at this stage, one of the mistresses, Louise de Kerouac, says to James, Duke of York, Charles's younger brother, and imminently to be king, she says, look, don't quote me, but he's always told me that he wanted to die a Roman Catholic. And at this stage, James, who's already converted very controversially to Catholicism, is quite excited. And he manages to get everyone out of the room. And he goes to his brother and says, is it true? Do you want to become a Roman Catholic? And at that point, the king indicates that that is his wish. And then there's a problem, because Roman Catholic priests who are English are not allowed to be in existence. And the only Roman Catholic priests anyone can think of are the Portuguese ones who look after the soul of the long-suffering queen, Charles's queen, Catherine of Braganza. And then one of them manages to think of the single English Roman Catholic priest he can think of in London. And there's this rather dramatic moment where Charles is lying there, very, very near to death, in need of an English Catholic priest to take him into the Catholic Church and presumably take rather a long confession. And at this point, James ushers in, out of the shadows, this old man. And James says to his brother, Sire, I bring you a man who once saved your life, and now he'll save your soul. And it's Father Huddleston. He's been allowed to stay alive because he is the great hero of this. And Charles had forgotten him. And I love the fact that on Charles's last full day on earth, he was reconnected with the 6 best weeks that he spent on it.
Thank
So
you.
I think we have time just for one question. 5 minutes.
Yes. We have time just for one question or two, just 5 minutes. But Charles has said before that he's very willing to talk to anyone when he's signing the book. So, yes, thank you. In the middle. Yes.
Thank you. It's a historical question. How do you judge the restoration and the fact that the British have remained faithful to the monarchy after having tasted the Republic? Do you believe that it was such a dismal experiment that they decided it was better to keep the crown henceforth?
Well, I think what happened was that the Republic really relied on Oliver Cromwell. He was the only parliamentary figure who had the loyalty of Parliament itself and the army. So once he died very unexpectedly in 1658, there wasn't anyone who could take his place. One of his sons, Richard Cromwell, tried to, and then realized it was beyond him and stepped aside. There were various other people who also tried. The most likely one was a man called John Lambert, but he had the indignity of being captured in what is now a supermarket car park in Daventry. But so the great men of history didn't really step forward. There wasn't anyone to take the place. And what the English hated, as most societies did at this time, was chaos. And there was a lot of fighting in towns between different factions. And actually, the Restoration was not long coming. I mean, in March 1660, the House of Commons voted against it. 2 months later, they were very much for it because things were unraveling. The default position, with no other strong leader, was to go back to the crown. Charles, who was a man of very good humor, when he arrived and was riding through these euphoric crowds, he was heard to say, well, if I'd known how popular I was, I'd have come back sooner. So it was a moment in time which he took advantage of. And then people fell over themselves to forget that they had been parliamentarian. And it looked as though it had all been a dreadful mistake. And people generally moved on quite quickly.
Thank you. The last one, just very, very quick in the row. Yes.
Hi. So lovely to see you here. You're such a delightful storyteller. It's really a talent. You're talking about a default position, about dilemmas in your country, and then, people doing all kinds of things and then coming back to a default position. Is there a resonance in your situation currently with the whole Brexit fiasco?
Yes.
Thank goodness I'm just here as a narrative historian and not a political commentator, and I'm going to sidestep, but thank you for the compliment. And I'm sure there is a very good Brexit event with Rachel Johnson and people tomorrow. But in that it's a vaguely controversial subject, I'm going to be a coward and avoid answering.
I think that's wonderful. But
and this man's been very patient. I think he should have the final
okay.
question.
It is interesting because it divides people just as the Parliament and the Crown did. It does divide.
Thank you. I have one question on the Order of the Royal Oak. I believe it did exist, but after the Restoration, the King thought it was divisive to overly reward royalists, and he really wanted to create a consensus. So that's why it didn't go on. Another very, very quick question is I believe quite a lot of Charles's clothing was given away to Shropshire families like the Actons, and they still have sort of his coats. Have you been researching his clothing from his time of the escape?
Well, the first thing, you're absolutely right. So part of the condition that Charles was allowed to return was not to give royalists their land back. That was all gone. Unless it was the church or the royal family, they didn't get their stuff back. And Charles had to be quite ruthless on that. The clothing, so he hid, the Pendrells hid his clothing down a hole, and I don't know what happened to it after that. I'm sure they kept it because they would have been treated with reverence. So I don't know if the Acton family or anyone else, but I'm sure they must have existed for some time afterwards and may still do so today. As Jenny mentioned, she's going to wrap it up. That was rather a short question time because I talked too much. But as she said, at the book thing, you don't have to buy a book. If you've got any other questions, please come and see me. I'm going to be signing books somewhere over there. But if you have just a general question, not about Brexit, do come and see me. But anyway.
Thank you. Well, we've all had a wonderful time, and just to thank Charles for that. You couldn't talk too much. Thank you.
To catch a